Yes, you did.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And he's going to talk about a wonderful topic that we've had a lot of interest in, which is Rock Island. And Richard said that he would kind of introduce himself, but he also wanted me to mention we're very fortunate. We have a gentleman who is filming tonight from Oshkosh Public Access Cable. So we will be able to preserve this presentation as well. And Richard also has some of his wonderful books that I'm sure he'd be willing to talk about afterwards. So please join me in welcome Richard.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate being invited to the Ephraim Town Hall, Village Hall, for this program. So thanks to the Ephraim Historical Foundation. I'm a member of the Island Archives, actually chairman of the archives, and so I have a close association with similar types of things across the way. A little bit about my background. I was born and raised in Sturgeon Bay, went to high school there, graduated from UW-Madison, journalism. Didn't work in journalism at all, really. Was in the Navy for 4 years following the college experience. And then my wife and I decided to come back to Washington Island rather than remain in California or some other center of naval activity. My wife, Mary Jo, is the youngest of 4 daughters of Arnie and Mary Richter. They own and operate the ferry service, and so that's what I became involved with. So for really the past 45 years, I've been involved with the Washington Island ferry line, both as a licensed captain and really probably the first 30, 35 years, almost always on the ferries, then in the office, and now in retirement, or mostly retirement. I don't spend any time in the office, but I do still operate the Carfee, which is a little passenger ferry that goes over to Rock Island. My interest in Rock Island actually grew from going over there in the winter on skis, wondering about Thordarson, a man I had heard about but didn't know a lot about. There really wasn't too much written about him. There was a little book written by island historian Conan Bryant Eaton back in the late 60s, early 70s. Very well done, but a very slim booklet, almost a pamphlet, about 80-some pages, and talked about Thordarson, and that was about it. So I began looking for more information, and about the same time that I did, a lady who lives on Washington Island, I spoke with her. Actually, it was before church started one day. I leaned over and asked her if she, a few questions about Rock Island, because I knew that her grandfather had worked for Thordarson, and her aunt had actually married a son of Thordarson. And so there was a close connection, and she actually, the aunt and her husband had died, and so there was a satchel, a little suitcase full of photos and documents. And she said, well, I think I'll bring those to the archive. She was a member of the archives committee at the time and was a volunteer there, so I thought, that's great. And I started looking through the documents and became even more interested, took some notes and photos and came back with a copy machine. I copied as much as I could. And then somebody in our archives decided that much of the material would be better off in Madison. So several years later, when I decided I really wanted to do more on this, I had to go to Madison and find not only the things that I looked for before, but more. So anyway, it was a kind of a chase. But in 2013, I published a book on Thordarson. And by the way, I wanted to say that I have schedules, ferry line brochures. That's how I can justify coming here. I advertise for the ferry line. So there's a ferry schedule, but also there's a schedule to Rock Island, should you ever be interested in going, on the little ferry called the Carfee. Means little fish in Icelandic. And there's also a bookmark there with a listing of books that I've published, self-published. And I have a few books there, and you can pick those up too, although appreciate it if I receive some remuneration for those. The most recent one is Words on Water 2, just published in December, and that is really, I would say, about living, working on Washington Island, what's involved, and there's also reflections, not only in my life, but what made things the way they are in Washington Island, and lots of photos. And I was encouraged to start a journal back in 2007 by Norbert Bly, and so that's kind of what got me going on both writing and publishing. And then I also brought some copies of this book along, Thorderson and Rock Island. And I'll read a couple of passages from this as we go along today. But the information that I've accumulated, learned, and hope I remember most of it, although I've used this actually to review here in the last number of days. I did through a process of learning about Thorderson from documents and photos, of which really there are quite a few. I had to decide what, because none of them were in order, what sense they made and put them in context and so forth. So let's start out with the slides. We're looking at the boathouse on Rock Island, which was built by Thorderson. Approximately 1925 is when that work started, and it was completed more or less in 1930. Two large openings where he could bring his boat inside and tie it up, or guests could, and a large hall on the upper floor. And I'll show some photos of that in a minute. And that's the little boat. It's a 49-passenger boat, and many days during summer we're taking campers to Rock Island, and people bring everything, including the kitchen sink, when they go camping, it seems. So the boat is really loaded some trips. And there are many what we call day visitors, people who go up to visit the lighthouse or hike around the island, or maybe go over to the southeast side where there's a nice sandy beach. Okay, two maps to kind of put us in place here geographically. And I'd like to point out, the one on the left is taken from an atlas published about 1848. And probably the information for that atlas came from an even earlier time. So things are not really as we know them today. The island's names, the place names, are either different or lacking. As an example, that's Washington Island, and I guess this refers to it, Potawatomi Island. That name was used on many charts, even up into the 1820s and 30s. And it's kind of unknown as to when exactly the name Washington Island was adopted officially. I've seen no documents on that, but it eventually was changed. There are just a grouping of islands here, which is not necessarily the case. It's really one island about right here, which would be Rock Island, what we call Rock Island. And in fact, there's a lighthouse on that island called Potawatomi Lighthouse. So the name Potawatomi was both used and misconstrued as to its location. When the government had orders, gave orders and contract to build the lighthouse, they were really unsure which place to build it. Was it going to be the northern tip of what we call Washington Island, or the northern tip of Rock Island? It wound up going to Rock Island. Some other interesting things about this chart. You can see the name up here, lit for Little Bay Denoquet, Denoquet. We just call it Bay de Noc today. Good Wisconsin accent. And then Big Bay, or Great Bay de Noc over here. That was from the Denoquet or Denoc Indian tribe, which lived in that area back at the time when the French voyagers came through. So, and then we have the modern chart here. Oh, one additional point here. The little circle there indicates Gibraltar. Man who owned that property wanted to have the county seat there, calling it Gibraltar, and that didn't happen. It became Bailey's Harbor, but that was his hope. And of course, Sturgeon Bay won out as the county seat. But this is an old map, as we say. And the other thing that we can learn from these charts, given the age of this chart, there are rivers and creeks. There are no roads shown, no railroads. The way to get around was strictly by water, first by canoes and sailing vessels, later by mechanically propelled vessels. And that is really what led to Lighthouse on the northern tip of Rock Island in 1836, the first government light on northern Lake Michigan. And all traffic coming in and out of Green Bay waters came through either the Rock Island Passage or the passage that we know as Death's Door, or Porte de Mort, named by the French, Porte de Mort, Door of Death, based on an oral history of large loss of life and canoes of an Indian tribe crossing from Washington Island to the peninsula. So that Death's Door, or Porte de Mort, we can thank the French for that name. It's one of the few names that remains in Door County that is French. The rest of them were changed by the British and then again by the US government in their maps. But the importance of these passages can't be underestimated. All supplies to the various ports down the shore of the Door Peninsula, including Ephraim, would have come through these passages. And the ship canal, as we know it today, I believe it was about 1885 when that was completed, dug through to the lake so that ships would have a shorter and perhaps safer means of accessing the bay. And by that time, there was also a fairly large town here in Sturgeon Bay. But back on this map, it was sand dunes and swamp. So that was dug about 1885 and allowed then ships to proceed through that passage rather than going around whether it was more dangerous or not, it was at least perceived to be more dangerous. There were, in fact, a lot of shipwrecks in the northern Door County area. On Rock Island in 1970-71, Professor Ron Mason, who was an anthropologist, archaeologist at Lawrence University, had a dig with students on Rock Island. He had actually planned to dig in another part of the state. Rain came down heavily for a long period of time. He felt that'd be too muddy. Let's go to Rock Island instead. And he found really a wonderful treasure of artifacts there, both Native American and what he believed to be not only European, but he thinks that they were part of LaSalle's group, items that had the mark of LaSalle on them. All of those artifacts, with the exception of just a very few that are on display in the boathouse now on Rock Island, reside at Lawrence University in a closet or basement or wherever they keep them. But he did a great study on this, and of course it refers here to Grand Traverse Islands. Now that's the string of islands that leads from the tip of the Door Peninsula northward to the upper peninsula of Michigan. There are about a dozen major islands, Washington Island being the largest. And the French could use those as stepping stones, more or less, to make their way southward. And in canoes or smaller, more fragile craft, they tended to follow the shore rather than do things offshore. So the European influence in the area began in the actually the early to mid 1600s. LaSalle is presumed to have come to this area, maybe to Rock Island, we think so. In September of 1679, loaded furs there, and part of the crew was diverted to go down the lake with LaSalle, and a skeletal crew was to take the vessel back to the eastern Great Lakes, where the furs would help to pay for the expedition. The Griffin was lost, has not yet been found, even though There are some who think that they found pieces of it, but that's not been conclusively proven. Now, with the navigation and the urge to settle the area, this was particularly so after the War of 1812. The U.S. government took over this territory, and they sent a group of ships to find a location for a fort at the mouth of the Fox River, Green Bay, Wisconsin. Well, wouldn't you know, they found the same spot that the French had used for a fort years before that. But in crossing the lake, the three vessels had very calm conditions, and the lead vessel, Washington, which was the largest of the bunch, anchored in the harbor on the north end of Washington Island, so hence Washington Harbor. The map makers and the officers on board saw to it that each new significant bluff, landmark, and island bore one of their names. So they took away French or British names and put their own names on it. Colonel Chambers for Chambers Island as one example. Colonel Boyer for Boyer's Bluff. For a while, Washington Island was called Miller's Island, and then that just fell by the wayside. But they were looking after themselves when they did this, of course. So with the navigation being on the rise, this light was built on the northern tip of Rock Island in 1836. I have two dates here because it was not a substantially built lighthouse. The masonry wasn't of good quality, so they had to rebuild the lighthouse structure in 1848. And so what you see here today is essentially the building as it was redone in 1848, very nicely renovated with the help of Friends of Rock Island and several grants in the 1990s. And now the volunteers of Rock Island, they call it Friends of Rock Island, they will man this lighthouse from about Memorial Day through Columbus Day, which is really the basic camping visitation season. And they show people through the lighthouse. It's one of the few lighthouses, I think, where you can climb up into the lantern room. Very narrow ladder. You have to be agile enough to do it, but it's a great view from there. I'm showing you something here that most people don't see. I didn't know that it existed, but Randy Holm is shown here pointing to a little building that was a smokehouse used by the lightkeeper. And you have to look around in the woods to the east to find it. I think he described it as a cold smoke lighthouse, smokehouse, I'm sorry. There was a fire that was built in stones about 3 feet away from the building, and then the smoke was drafted up through a little tunnel made of stones up into the structure. And I could get inside, but I had to duck to do it. The smokehouse is covered with tin that still has some of the red paint on it. And they were the size of fuel oil cans used to bring kerosene or fuel up to the lighthouse years back. So this isn't as old as the lighthouse, certainly, but it probably goes back to the 1880s or something like that. For preserving fish, venison, whatever meat they could come upon. Randy was the ranger then, and he's since retired. This picture shows the dock structure as it was back in 1914, I believe was the year. And the people who are there, because I know the batch of photos that it came from and I could identify the individuals, it includes Thorderson, and I believe that's him, and two young men, probably one of them at least is his son, and this would be the long coat here and kind of a high military looking cap is Ed Cornell, who was the lightkeeper at Rock Island at the time. And when Thorderson looked around for property, he first looked on Washington Island. He was born in Iceland, immigrated here with his parents and at least a couple of siblings, in 1873 to Milwaukee first. His father died, and then his mother moved them around from one place to another. He never never settled on Washington Island or Rock Island, but his wife's parents did. She was from Arabaki, which is where a lot of people were from who came to Washington Island. We also have Norwegians and Danes, Germans and Irish, but we do have a unique population who were Icelanders. But with that connection, her parents lived on Washington Island, so that was a reason for Thordarson and his wife to come up and visit, and because of that, he liked the land, liked the property, and in 1910 had a chance to purchase a good portion of Rock Island. So here he is, really kind of being shown around, I think, by Ed Cornell, the lightkeeper. At the time that Thordarson bought Rock Island, and he loved the fact that it was very natural. Not a lot of timber cutting. There had been some done, but not a lot. But on the eastern side of Rock Island, there had been a fishing village. When he bought the island, the buildings were pretty much fallen in. An exception was this structure on the right-hand side, which had been lived in by the Anton Jacobson family. They were the last family to live on Rock Island. Rock Island's population grew when the lighthouse was built. That meant there was a regular traffic to the island, means of shipping out salted fish. And so there's a little fishing village on the east side of Rock Island. As the name implies, it's not a very good place for farming. But the east side, there's a little bit of an area that could be tilled and farmed. And they drew their boats up on the beach, many of the fishermen, because there wasn't a suitable harbor. Now, Jacobson was the last to live there, and we think it was in about 1890 that they left and went to Washington Island. Others left after the Civil War. There had been a population of about 100 individuals, families for the most part, on Rock Island, and the population exceeded Washington Island. The township of Washington, town of Washington, was organized on Rock Island in 1850, and that became the first organized township in Door County. Strange to think of it that way today, because Washington Island is now a backwater, so to speak, to the rest of the peninsula. That's because we do everything by highway, by automobile, and by freight truck. But in those days, with the harbors and the maritime activity, Washington Island was starting to, its economy was starting to pick up. And they were organized enough to have a town chairman there, who then became a county supervisor. And so the first county meeting of supervisors took place on Rock Island in 1855. So that was the first official county board meeting, and can you guess what they did? They agreed to raise taxes. That was the purpose of the meeting, to raise taxes. So anyway, here we have our county board. This was a Jacobson home after Thordarson had done some work to it. He picked out a number of buildings. He wasn't going to fix them all up, but some that he felt had some promise, and he began to fix them up little by little. So this is the Jacobson home, and then years later, another facelift, and Thordarson himself lived in this when he came to Rock Island for many years. Seemed to prefer, he'd walk the half mile or 2/3 of a mile, whatever it was, from where the boathouse is today over to this area and spend his nights there. This photo shows Thordarson along with a couple of friends of his. I think they're actually perhaps employees from his plant in Chicago, and his young son Trig, or rather Dewey, that was his oldest boy, in front of a cabin that he proudly wrote to H.R. Holland, historian in Door County from the Ephraim area, kind of playing up the fact that he had shored up this building, and he believed it to be the oldest structure in the county. This photo was taken nearer to where the boathouse is today. The government had boathouse with a marine railway where they could pull their craft up onto the beach. This faced Jackson Harbor. But then from there, the lightkeeper would have to schlep all of the goods and supplies from there all the way up to the lighthouse. At least one of them had a horse. I think several employed a horse to help get the materials up there. It's approximately a mile, mile and a quarter to the lighthouse, and not super arduous, but you know, if you're hauling flour and all of these other essential supplies, it took a little bit out of you, and I don't think the lightkeepers were all that young. So in this photo, I can identify Thordarson, son with an axe on his shoulder, and again, the lightkeeper, Ed Cornell, and probably because there's a light snow, I'm guessing that photo is the same one, same day, in fact, that was taken, a photo was taken up by the lighthouse itself. This perhaps is another visit to Rock Island, but Thordarson's wife, Juliana Frederiksdotter was her name, feeding a deer which they named Daisy, and the young son Dewey to one side. It's probably the Jacobson house there. This photo shows Thordarson as a young man, started out with his manufacturing. When they married in 1895, Juliana, who is shown here in Icelandic costume, encouraged him to start his own business. She had her own business as a dressmaker, very successful. And in her shop, supposedly she made dresses for Marshall Fields and other well-known department stores in the area. So she was successful as a businesswoman. So he had worked for other companies learning the electrical business, and he was very, very bright. Didn't have much formal schooling, but had a tremendous intellect and remembered everything and experimented. And you know, through his life, he had over 100 patents. Although he didn't invent the transformer, he had enough improvements to it that became his bread and butter product for the Thordarson manufacturing. If you go to Rock Island Boathouse, you'll see one of those today. So he became, in that day, very, very successful. That allowed him to buy Rock Island and to begin to put improvements on it. This book on the cover says Potawatomi Island. His preference really was that the island would be called named after the Indian tribe that had lived there, at least when many of the voyagers had come through. I think other tribes at various times occupied Rock Island, but the Potawatomi certainly had in the 1700s. And so this album, very nicely done, beautiful black and white photos, mounted on a linen backing, which I haven't seen any other place before, but it's a high quality type of album. There were two of them. One stayed in the family. He might have had more, but two that I know of. One in the family that wound up going to the island archives. The other one was presented as a gift to H.R. Holland, and then I think it went to his daughter, wound up going from his daughter, somehow Bill Beckstrom got it, was in the area, lived in the area, and then from Bill Beckstrom to Ingrid Johnson. And then Ingrid contacted me because she knew I was with the archives on the island, so we got the second copy. And the photos are somewhat similar photos, but there are also some different ones, but really a great thing to have in terms of Thordarson. Most of the photos, old-time photos, are from such an album, so I've copied those. And I included Holland here because they were correspondents. Thordarson was a great correspondent and was very interested in history. The business side and invention side was science, electricity. He was very much for alternating current versus direct current like Edison. He's been compared with Tesla in some ways for being very inventive. But In his correspondence, quite warm at times, but when Holland published Peninsula Days, he was looking to recover his money, and Thordarson must have said, oh sure, I'll take a couple of boxes, but when it came time to pay up, he wasn't quite so interested. And Holland reminded him of it, and instead of just writing the check and forget about it, just do it, because they were friends supposedly, Thordarson said, well, I suppose I could take maybe a dozen or 20 copies for friends, and the rest I'll have to get rid of somehow. Just kind of that was the way he often dealt with people, even those who knew him fairly well. It was kind of a letdown, I think, to Holland, who needed the money. This is Thordarson at his carved desk in a Chicago office, 1925, and I say that because there was an article done, an interview with him, one of the very few interviews, the only one actually that I've come across that really, he told about his childhood and so forth, and forthcoming, in the way he talked about himself. Otherwise, there's very little information in that regard. So he had not only this desk, beautifully carved, but also bookcases that he made that held his books. He was, and probably should be known as much for his book collection as for his invention and manufacturing prowess. He began collecting books as a very young man, even though he wasn't making much money, put his money toward books, and he tried to get not only first editions, but the best copy of the first editions that he could find through booksellers. All right, the boathouse is just one of many buildings that he constructed on Rock Island. At first they were log buildings, or what I think the term was Kellastone, which I think was a brand name for kind of a stucco covered building. He had several of those. And then about 1925, he began building these stone structures, really beautifully designed, graceful design, nice proportions. And this black and white photo, which was among the photos that I found in this suitcase, it had a compass arc drawn around it, which I can't prove that Thordarson did it, but I have a feeling he did, because he was always very proud of what he did, that he could be demonstrating or showing to someone the proportions of the building, and the point of the compass would have been right at the base of the two doors. So he had a Chicago architect do the actual blueprints, probably the engineering for it and so forth, but I think the basic look came from him. And this shows that kind of a challenging project to build those arches. Many of the workers came from Washington Island. The two main masons were the Erdahl brothers from Sturgeon Bay, Norwegians. This is another picture, a modern picture, looking through the gate toward the finished boathouse product. These two little doors right here, I was shown, you go down a stairway and you wind up underneath, basically underneath this wooden porch or deck here, and this whole front area was used for storing ice. So ice would be taken up from the bay and pulled up, I suppose, by horses or what have you, up this cement walk and then put inside with sawdust so they had a supply of ice. This just shows the multitude of buildings when it was really in the construction phase. Many of these are worker buildings, either for dining or where workers stayed. You can see the top of the boathouse here, so it had to be somewhere between 1925 and 1930, I would guess. This stone fence, still very much intact. The posts are no longer there, they've rotted away, but that was not just for looks, it was to keep deer out of his gardens. He had extensive plantings, trees, other planting, and the deer were hard on his plants. He protected them at all costs. The first 10, 15 years that he owned the island, would not let people from Washington Island over to hunt, only his friends, a few Chicago friends. And that came around to bite him in a way, and so he then asked for a permit to take away the deer, or hunt as many as he could. So this fence was a preventative measure, not successful. The deer still found their way in. Okay, the boathouse, this is down in the boat, one of the boat bays, and you could bring a craft in, tie it up, and then on this level, which is now submerged by high water, by the way, you'd go into a dressing area, and then up steps, and the next level would be the ladies' and men's toilets. And quite nicely appointed, I must say, for 1925 in northern Door County on an island. They have 3 nice flushing commodes. I don't think too many people have that. And in the men's, there were 4 urinals lined up side by side. Now, that's a bit overkill, I think, because as you know, it always takes, the line is longer at the women's than it is at the men's. But fancy plumbing, and it also indicated that at some point he thought about having large groups of people hosting them in the boathouse. And he did on a few occasions, but perhaps not as much as he originally might have thought. He was a very private person. This shows Thorderson here showing someone one or several of his books. Here the light chandelier that he devised. It has like glass crystals of different colors on the ends and buffalo horns and so forth. He had that rigged up in the center of the boathouse floor, and here's a picture after it was completed. Now this furniture is a different set of furniture than the carved furniture. I don't know what happened to this furniture, but it was replaced or done away with probably in 1941. This is Thorderson, just for the effect of a photo, with several companions on a table with, well, I don't know, I suppose they did have coffee and tea or something there, but it was really just to show the size, the scale of the fireplace. And from an Icelandic book that was written about Thorderson through an interpreter, I was able to find out who these individuals were. And so this is Thorderson in kind of a Japanese-looking outfit. This man was Icelandic carver Halldor Einarsson, who carved his furniture and did other carvings in the boathouse and in the area. He was from Iceland, came to Chicago, was a wood carver who hired out to do different types of commercial carvings for the most part. And so Thorderson hired him to do the furniture for him back in the 1920s. And 1 or 2 of these men are plant managers for Thorderson. I think this man was the one, he was making the rounds in 1931. I think it was the 1000th year of Icelandic Republic. Big deal in Iceland. Althing and the Icelandic Republic had been going for 1,000 years. He was going around soliciting money, and perhaps looking for a donation from Thorderson. There's this copper etching plaque in the boathouse. You've probably heard it referred to as the Viking Hall or something like that. That's Thorderson himself never used that name. That was given by somebody else, and it kind of stuck, unfortunately, I think, because it's not really a Viking hall, but it does have maybe some elements or reminders of things that people somehow think might have been Viking or Icelandic. But this is what he called it, the jewel house of art and nature. And the quotation beneath that name actually was from Hugh Platt. I don't know who he was, but apparently an English author, from 1594. And then the saying beneath it by Arthur Bouchier, 1586, a storehouse for thy wise conceits, a whetstone for thy wit, where each man may with dainty choice his fancies finely fit. I don't know why Thordarson would have picked that, but he knew what book it was in and asked a bookseller to find it for him because he had read it at some point. He had a great, I think, photographic type memory. Besides centering finally on science books, he had many of Old English literature, and he actually started out with Norse literature and maps, so just an extremely wide area of interest. This is one of the photos out of his album, and I think it's a commercially taken photo to demonstrate the construction of this 1 million volt transformer that his company made, that he designed for the Panama Pacific exhibition in San Francisco. He had participated in an exhibition in St. Louis and won a medal there, and he did the same in San Francisco. This is when it was popular, and they had this transformer going between a big arc between two terminals, and apparently, you know, if ladies had hairpins in their hair with just all kinds of electricity coming from it, they would glow almost. But it was seen as a fun thing, new and fun, not a danger. This gentleman came on the ferry one day, and it was after I'd done the book. I just happened to be on board, and he had a device he was going to take up to Rock Island and donate. He found this either on Craigslist or, you know, some source like that. But these things are still around somewhere. Thordarson products were so well made, I'm told, that they, you know, lasted forever and ever. I don't know. This was a condenser tester, I believe. So, okay, this photograph was kind of the marking of an important time. And Gene McDonald, who was the president of Zenith Corporation, brought together some of his friends, drinking buddies, I think, many of them, from Chicago, convinced Thordarson to join them, and they were going to take a cruise in early November to Rock Island. Who would go on a cruise in early November? But they did. And he said in a letter to Thordarson, who was standing right here, that he'll introduce him to Mayor William Hale Thompson, Big Bill Thompson, and I think you'll get along really well. And apparently they did. So this was a long weekend on Rock Island. Tied his boat up at the pier. He had a cook on board, and you know, they stayed. I think they stayed in the buildings on shore. Thompson and his friends, I think the same weekend, because the hats are and the characters are the same. And after this short weekend, amazing, Thordarson, who was extremely private, wrote to Thompson and said he would build him a cabin in cowboy style, kind of a log style, I guess, at no cost to him, and he would be free to come and go and use the island with his friends as much as he wished. This was a terrific departure for Thordarson, and I don't know what the other half of the story is. I can only imagine. There had to be some sort of greasing of the palm. You know, either Mayor Thompson was going to do something for him regarding electrification of the city of Chicago. I don't know. There is a lot of speculation having to do with illicit booze being brought through Rock Island. I have found nothing, and probably will find nothing in that regard. I think the people who he associated with, including Thordarson himself, liked to drink. But I personally think that that would have been too far out for Thordarson. I mean, he was too straight an arrow, I believe, and couldn't afford to have his reputation ruined. But it does raise some interesting questions on why he would have associated with Thompson, who was really a kind of a bozo of a mayor. I mean, he did some good things, but he was also, you know, have to shake your head at, you know, he supported the people who were bringing in the alcohol during Prohibition, and then he flip-flopped and went against Prohibition a number of years later. Ran for national office and was not successful. This photo indicates that he did have some occasional high-powered friends there. And again, I think that Gene MacDonald, the man who's standing with the pipe, was sort of the instigator, the one who kept the social wheel rolling. So we have Clarence Darrow sitting in the chair. The middle fellow is Tom Guinan, who was Thorderson's caretaker on Rock Island. Otherwise, he lived on Washington Island. He had quite a colorful personal history too, but worked for Thorderson. Now this is the cabin that was built for Thompson, taken from the ice in winter. And it's a long, narrow structure. It no longer exists. All of the wooden buildings were bulldozed and taken down when the property became state property in 1964. The decision someone made was that they would get rid of those buildings rather than have them as a liability. They were still in good condition, good repair at that time. They just didn't want the responsibility and liability. So they were done away with. Today they would, it still takes money, but I think people would try to save them as historical structures. If there was liquor brought to Rock Island, I'm guessing it could have been in this cellar area here below the mayor's cabin, but we'll never know. I mentioned about the tank house in the caption. So up the hill, as you go toward the lighthouse, you have to walk up a kind of a steep but short hill, and there's a stone building, and inside of that is a cement cistern, and water was pumped up to that, and that water then was used for flushing in the various buildings that Thorderson had, and also for irrigating his plants. He also had a fountain, and there's one or several photos showing the water, spurting up in the air about 15 feet high. So, he had things worked out, and the source of water was the bay. Here is the structure today, pretty well broken up. Lots of poison ivy in that area, so I would advise caution if you ever go up there. And so Randy Holm took me down to the base of that staircase, and you see cast iron pieces. That was the pump, probably a gasoline pump, but a big old cast iron pump used to draw water from the lake and push it up the hill into that cistern. If you go up the hill and then make a right on the first trail, and you look carefully in the woods, you might see this pile of building tiles. I never knew it existed, but again, Randy showed it to me, and it's believed that these tiles were intended for the construction of a library on Rock Island. 1941, he sold his business to the Burgess Battery Corporation, and he had to move his furniture out. So that's one reason why he brought it from Chicago to the Rock Island Boathouse, along with his bookcases and books. But he did have a plan at one point to build a library to house his books. I think he fell in financial difficulties in the mid-1930s. I think his dreams kind of plummeted with that financial fall. And I think he also ran out of energy to a great extent. He had done a lot of building and was trying to hold all the pieces together and was having trouble doing so. But these tiles, there must be several thousand of them stacked in the woods. You won't see it unless you look for it. These three men, often associated together by either correspondence or in person, and they call themselves the Three Musketeers. But this is Thorderson on the left, Walter Hill, who was a preeminent bookseller in Chicago and knew all of the top booksellers, so books would come to him from Europe. He would alert his best customers of their being available, and he knew what Thorderson was looking for, what he was trying to collect. He knew what quality he was looking for, and then, and so it was really a an association of friendship. And at times, Thordarson couldn't pay him. He was short on cash, and Hill still managed to, help him along with the books. The other fellow on the right, Christian Bay, was he was a librarian at the Creer Library in Chicago, which I believe is a science library first and foremost. Is that right? And he became the head librarian there. And he was the one who was responsible, actually, got a finder's fee when the University of Wisconsin bought Thordarson's books in 1946. There's a little model of the library that exists in the boathouse. Well, we'll come to another photo showing the books being moved, but Christian Bay helped to make that transition from Rock Island to the University of Wisconsin for the collection. This is an interesting photo here, I think, because it shows his youngest son, Trygve, his granddaughter, his only granddaughter, Julie Ann, and Trygve's wife, Louise, in St. Augustine. The story here is that he was such a micromanager and meddler that both sons tried working for him. It was difficult. Trig had an engineering degree from University of Wisconsin. He left with his wife, who was pregnant. They went down to Florida and drove around trying to find a place that they felt was comfortable, suitable, and they landed in St. Augustine, where they built a home, and that's where they lived, and that's where Julianne actually lives today. They didn't want to be around the old man. He was too much of a meddler. But he came down to visit, and by this time Thordarson was separated from his wife. He didn't even like the fact that the daughter was named Julie Ann after the grandmother Juliana. So kind of petty, but that was the way he was. So this is the photograph. Now Julie Ann is sitting on the pier. I suppose she's about 5 or 6 years old. And the books are being hoisted off of the boathouse deck down onto the ferry Griffin and transported to Gills Rock, where they would go then by truck. And they were initially put in the State Historical Society building in Madison because there wasn't room for them, and they had to deal with them as a collection. They knew that it was valuable. They got the collection for $170,000, and they even had a big debate over that, whether or not they could come up with the money. But it included one of these 4 elephant folio Audubon books. Each page probably goes for maybe $100,000 today, worth millions anyway, and many other first editions that are considered, absolutely, collector's items, rare book items. And so once they were cataloged, and the University of Wisconsin made a decision which books were truly rare, which were not, that would be placed in circulation, general circulation in the UW library. Well, then a rare book collection was formed with Thordarson's collection as the basis, and then eventually a new wing built on the Memorial Library, which housed these books. In the boathouse, you'll see some very unique carvings. These were done by Halder Enerson, very similar to the old type of Viking carvings. And many of them depict Norse mythology. In this picture, I had some guests a year ago from Iceland, and they were very interested. Most Icelanders who come here to see the Thordarson boathouse. They know about Thordarson. They also know about the immigration from Iceland to Washington Island. They know more about it than most islanders do. So here we have grandfather, son, and grandson. So this is Jonas Asgrimsson, his, I should say, Asgrimur Jonasson, his son Jonas Asgrimsson, and the grandson is, again, Asgrimur Jonasson. So that's confusing in itself. But anyway, we had a nice dinner, invited people from the public, and he was looking to find for more information on Thordarson and his electrical inventions. He wanted to do a book on the electrification of Reykjavik. Let's see. This plaque I've seen on the wall many times. I've really paid no attention to it. And the son, Jonas, pointed out to me, and you have a little hard time seeing this maybe, but so this is a honorary diploma given by the University of Wisconsin to Thordarson. Down here at the bottom is a baby in the cradle, and there's some runic carvings here on the foot of the cradle. I don't know what they mean. Then bare feet go off either way, baby feet. Here, now the man is holding a lightning bolt. This could be Thordarson, learning by doing. He's mastering electricity. And then as you come up this way, the type of footprint is no longer bare feet, but what I take to be sandals, wooden sandals, or wooden shoes. And then at the top, I don't know exactly what that depicts. I think it has to do with maybe medieval guilds, that kind of thing, but he became a master of electricity. Now he's in leather shoes and he arrives at point X, whatever that is. That's achieving the top, I guess. If you go the other way, again, bare feet, and these are only about that long with the toes carved in and everything. Very nicely done. And this is a library here, books, so he's learning by books. And this is hard to see, but it's a mortar board, so he's graduating. So now he's doing it by academic means on this side and still arriving at point X. So I thought it was a cleverly done frame, had to be carved by Halder Einarsson. This sketch was in one of Thordarson's notebooks. He had many notebooks that he would carry with him, always writing in something. And somehow Halder Einarsson, the woodcarver, had sketched this in, a crosscut of a church, sod roof, turf and rock sides, and the altar on the right. And if you see the little name here, it says Dory. I didn't really know what that meant when I was doing the book, so I wasn't sure who did those sketches. But later I looked at the photo of Thordarson at his desk more closely, and this is a model of the church that was shown in the sketch. It was never built, but at least there was some discussion of it. Thordarson himself never really gave an indication of belief in a higher spirit. Just very cold in his letters, but nothing that would ever reveal belief in a Christian belief anyway. And then this kind of concluded it for me. I figured out what Dory was. This came to the archives one day. It had been kicking around in the town offices and they were going to get rid of it. It was a whale's tooth carved with a likeness of one of the original 4 Icelandic men. Gudmundur Gudmundsson, and on the reverse side is a picture of his wife, carved in. I mean, beautifully done. Again, done by Halder Einarsson, who called himself Dory. So that kind of solved that. This is at the Jacobson Museum now, if you go and visit there near Little Lake. This is on display. So this was given, there was a card in the glass case that said to the people of Washington Island from the Icelandic Association of Chicago in 1970. So that was the 100th year celebration of Icelanders coming to Washington Island. This next year will be the 150th year. So we're hoping to have some kind of a celebration, or at least a remembrance of that particular date, both here and in Iceland. We'll see how that turns out. I mentioned how people are familiar in Iceland with what goes on here. My son Hoyt and his family were taking a cab ride to the Reykjavik city pool. And so they got in this minivan. This big guy, 6'8", was driving the van. He said, okay, so where are you from? Typical starting question. And I said, well, a little island in Lake Michigan. You probably never heard of it. No, Rock Island? And he said, well, close. We're in Washington Island. Oh, really? So then they started talking about Thordarson, and Hoyt told him that I had done a book, and I took 2 with me in a suitcase to give to some friends, but he was so interested in it. He said when he got to the pool, he kind of forgot to turn off. He had to drive behind a hot dog stand and up on the grass, and gave him a card and said, when you finish, give me a call, I'll pick you up, because he wanted to continue the conversation. So the following morning, he came to the hotel, and I gave him a book. And his name is Halder Gisli Sigurðsson. And he claimed to be making an automobile using some of Thordarson's electrical inventions. I don't know what that meant exactly, but he was. And so just coincidentally, when we were ready to leave a week later, we're at the Keflavik airport. It's about 45 minutes out of Reykjavik. And we were family members. There were 11 of us, and we had our bags, and we were just about to go in through the check-in process. And I said, oh, look at that outside. There's Halder out there. He was just dropping some fare off, people off, getting their bags out. And he said, I'm going to go out and say hi. So he did. And he said he had my book on the dash, and he was already about a quarter of the way through it. So, and probably not real easy reading for him since he's Icelandic, but anyway, interesting connection. So this is the car fee that goes to Rock Island. I'm advising going on a better day than this, but we do try to run whenever we can, as long as we can, as long as it's safe. The high water has made that more difficult because the pier doesn't protect us as it would in the lower water. So that's it for my presentation, but if you have questions, I'd be very happy to take them. Yes, sir?
Yeah, with that picture, what is the water level like when you're looking at this picture?
Okay, the question was, what is the water level like as compared with this photograph? Well, in this particular photo, I think the rail of the ferry is either at or slightly below the dock height, and right now we have 3 steps from the boat deck to get down to the dock, and the water is within that far from the top of the pier. So if we get any wind at all or wave action that washes over, there's virtually no protection for us behind the pier. And the inside of the boathouse, which had cement walks where you could go in and tie up an outboard boat or a canoe or something, that's probably under by a good 10 inches in there. Yeah. So it's discouraging, but we hope it goes back the other way. Yes, sir.
Kind of in the same vein, we've seen a really pretty beach, which you talked about before, and we know what's happened to the beaches here on, the peninsula. Is the beach still there?
It's a good question. I think it's broad enough that there's still beach, but of course it's been shortened up. And I haven't been over to the sand beach myself, so I can't, say for sure. But I have been around to a few other beaches on Detroit Island, for instance, and yeah, the material washes away and it just is a totally different look. You're almost into the trees when you step off a boat. Not much of a, but people do go over there, so I'm assuming they're finding some beach area. Yes, sir?
Who did he purchase the island from? And did he own the whole island? And how much did it cost?
Thordarson began by buying one large chunk that belonged to a man named Rasmus Hansen who lived in Jackson Harbor. He was actually grandfather of Jeannie Hutchins, I referred to her earlier. He had about 600 acres and he had owned it for about 10 years. He was logging it, taking wood off of it, but here this opportunity came along to sell it for cash. And his wife was from Denmark, and apparently part of the reasoning was to get some cash so she could go back and see her family in Denmark. So this is just a little side thing. So she did that, came back, contracted pneumonia or some really tough illness, and passed away, and I think it was in Sister Bay in a hotel. She just never made it back to the island, close, but never quite made it back. So Rasmus Hansen had the biggest chunk, and there was about 900 acres in all. About 127 acres, I think, belonged to the federal government around the lighthouse, so that stayed intact. That became, it still is, I think, federal. Some of that might have been transferred to the DNR in more recent years, but then all these other little pieces of land he had to try to get from the owners, and for the most part it wasn't a problem. They had moved off, family members probably had the deeds, so they had to be tracked down, and he had a gentleman on Washington Island help him do that. There weren't really real estate brokers in the day, but a man named Arnie Goodmanson, who was Ernie Richter's grandfather and an Icelander, took on that job of contacting them. There was one or two holdouts, and Thordarson was really kind of irate. You know, he said such things as, "I'll put a fence across the island and they'll never get to their property," or, you know, I've offered him, you know, $200, take it or leave it. If he doesn't want it, fine, I'll turn my back on the island. I won't spend any more money there. You know, he's just bitter kind of an individual, trying to squeeze them as much as he could. But eventually he got the property. And so it was all under his ownership, yes.
I just wanted to say I have read Words on Water, and it's a lovely book, and I just enjoyed it very much.
Oh, good, thank you. Which one, the first one or this one?
Words on Water, well, it was where you spent a lot of time on the ferry.
Okay, well, I did that years ago, certainly. Probably the first book.
Maybe that's the first one.
Yeah, and so I've done like a second one now. It's sort of a follow-up. The idea is I'm doing things that are similar but a little different perspective anyway, 10 years later. Grandfather and so forth. Yes, ma'am?
Is there a list of the books that were in his library?
Um,
And is that on the island?
Yeah, yes, I do have some copies of listings of the most important books, and that was done by a librarian for the University of Wisconsin. He wrote actually a couple of papers on that. But it's not an easily accessible list as far as that goes. I wish I could say off the top of my head. He had, I think it was a Coverdale Bible from 15 something or other, a very early Bible version, printed version. He had a first edition and a good one of Newton's Principia Mathematica, if I've got that right. Very important. I mean, that's some of Newton's basic laws of physics were laid out in that book. But he also had some very rare books on botany. He's kind of had a favoritism for botany. He had a greenhouse on Rock Island for a number of years and actually tried to have someone there to feed wood in a boiler to create the heat necessary to keep things going in the greenhouse. That was kind of I think, proved to be a futile effort after a while. But no, he was really into botany. One of the experiments he had on Rock Island was he had heard about this somewhere, but maybe, he just had a very active mind, was to put a grid of wires in the woods, in a shady woods, among the trees, and he thought by having this electrical grid, it might cause the plants to grow in the absence of sunlight. I don't think that was successful either, but don't have any readouts on, what the results were, but he referred to it in his letters. Another one was a machine, a wave motion machine, where the motion of the machine would actually help pump the water up the hill to the tank house. That didn't come to fruition either, but he always had these ideas going. Yes, sir?
Where did Thordarson go after he sold the island and moved off there? Where did he end his life?
Well, the way it ended, in his later years, he would still come up and spend as much time as he could on Rock Island, but during World War II, he spent a lot of time working on experiments, his inventions, and I think he was working on radar, and many others were at the same time. That was one of the inventions. And he didn't actually have his company, but he had a machine shop there on Rock Island, and he tinkered with things there. Um, his wife would come for a couple weeks, she'd leave, and then he'd come. That's the way that worked. Then he was in ill health in late 1944, 45, and she then came to him and helped care for him the last number of months. He died in 1945, and the remaining family members, and there weren't many, his wife, his two sons, and and their wives, and then the granddaughter. And the sons didn't get along too well at that point. And much of the furniture, well, the books were sold the following year to the University of Wisconsin. He had already made some inroads with them, with the university. He knew many people there prior to his death. So that was kind of in the works, but nothing, no official agreement made until after he died. I think I gave you the figure of something like $170,000 plus a $30,000 finder's fee. So they were shipped off, and I think that helped the family pay off some debts. Then they kind of skimped along. The sons weren't particularly successful, certainly didn't have a great amount of money, and the island, I think, was falling into disrepair, the buildings that he had. Dewey and his wife, Helga, continued to live in summers on Rock Island. I think the other son and his wife kind of stayed away. They remained in Florida. Maybe business reasons kept them there, but there was an argument then when finally, which way should sell to developers or sell it to the state of Wisconsin. And I think Julianne and her mother, her father died by this time, Trigby, they wished that it would go to, so the public could enjoy it. So it wound up being offered to the state of Wisconsin. And again, there was quite a debate and discussion that went back and forth over a year and a half before the state legislature finally decided to take Rock Island on as a state park. There were already enough state parks in the county. That was one argument that people had, but so they did buy the island then. And in doing so, all of the possessions had to be taken off Rock Island. If you're interested, I can read a little piece of that for you, but it takes a little bit of time. But anyway, Thordarson died in 1945. His wife died, I believe, in 1954. She was buried on Rock Island, on Washington Island in the cemetery as you go down to Schoolhouse Beach. His ashes remained in an urn in the boathouse on Rock Island until 1964. They had to move their possessions out because it was going to be a state park. There was a Roan tug and barge that came up to the boathouse to load on furniture, possessions. And as this is the story according to George Alm, who lives on Washington Island, and it's a good story. So anyway, he said he was there when this happened. He often took his motorboat up there and visited with them from Washington Island. And so as the barge was pulling out, he said, "Hey, you forgot the urn of ashes. Do what you want with them, you keep them." And so he claims to have taken them to the cemetery, dug a hole with his hands in the sand, buried the urn of ashes, put a flat stone over the top. Now, a few months later, or a year later, we're not really sure, a park ranger is talking to people who are around the fence there at the cemetery, describing that this is, Thordarson is buried here. There was a headstone by now, which apparently Dewey must have bought and put in place. But the real story, according to Jeannie Hutchins, is that her husband went up in the air in a plane with Dewey Thordarson. They scattered most of the ashes over the land by air. But here you have a man who was really a significant inventor and an individual, died in 1945, and his ashes weren't disposed of until 1964. What does that tell you about family dynamics? It really was a dysfunctional family, or there's a lot of dislike or something that The one story that I'd heard when I started working at the ferry line was that his ashes were in the bar in the boathouse, and the boys liked to drink. And one of them was heard to say to the other, "Let's go throw the old man overboard." But they never did dispose of the ashes until apparently at the very last. So, interesting person, very up and down in his emotional range. I would say bipolar, but I'm not a psychiatrist, but he exhibited some unusual characteristics. Yes, ma'am.
Had the island been sold to developers, do you think it really would have turned into anything?
Knowing what some of the other property, how long that took to sell and develop, I think it would have taken a long time. Another example is St. Martin's Island, which was finally sold from the Eline family to Luber family, and eventually they gave it, most of it, gave it or sold it to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, not too long ago. So those properties are hard to get to. They're not easily accessible, and as beautiful as they are from a natural standpoint, and as fun as it might sound to think of an island being your own, to develop it is a whole nother deal. So I think it would not have been very successful. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I just hope that you all come back next week for our July 16th meeting. Ephraim's very own Linda Carey will be talking about the Knudsen House, which corresponds to an exhibit at the Ephraim Historical Foundation. So if you haven't had a chance to go look at the hotel exhibit, please do. And again, thank you so much, Richard, for being here. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.